I get this question asked on this YouTube channel every now and again. It's, should I script out my entire solo podcast? We'll answer that coming up next. Hey there, podcaster. My name is Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. Today's video is brought to you by my 6 clever ways to monetize a podcast. A link for this ebook is available in the description below on this YouTube video or on my website at theshanman.com. But make sure you're checking the description of this YouTube video for any coupon codes so that it might get you a deep discount on the ebook itself. But if you're someone who's trying to get into the sponsorship game for your podcast and you're thinking, man, it's probably time to start sponsoring this podcast, this ebook will help you and walk you through the steps of developing those strategies for monetization. But it's just not about sponsorships. It's about 5 other ways you can monetize that you're missing out, the opportunities that you're missing out on making money with your podcast. Results do vary for this particular ebook, so just understand that these are the strategies that I use for this YouTube channel and of course my podcast, and they definitely do work. So go ahead and grab it today, the 6 clever ways to monetize a podcast. Today we're talking all about whether or not we should script out our solo podcast. This is an interesting question because people have asked it on this channel in the comments before, and I'm thinking, it's not really a topic worthy of actually talking about, but it continues to come up, and so I figured let's go ahead and answer that question. Now, let's say you are a solo podcaster, which I know there's a lot of you out there that are doing solo podcasts, and you tell me that you script out your entire podcast for your audience. Now, I'm going to tell you this first off, okay, as maybe a disclaimer. If you're doing something that works for you and you have longevity with your podcast, maybe you're at episode 100 and you have been doing it the same way over and over by scripting out your podcast, I say keep doing it. But for those podcasters who are jumping into the game and trying to figure out the game of podcasting, we have to consider what podcasting is, number one, and then we have to consider the purpose of our podcast. So when I look at podcasting and we consider what podcasting is, I look at it as just an extension of radio. Okay, it's an extension of talk radio is all it is. And this extension allows the presenter to come in and talk into the microphone and develop a relationship with the audience. All right, that relationship is built by sharing examples and by sharing interviews and sharing different accounts or answers to their audience so that they can develop this kind of symbiotic relationship with their audience. All right, then we have to determine what is the purpose of our podcast. And I say this time and time again on this channel. What's the purpose? Are you educating, entertaining, or doing both? Podcasting is a little bit of both. I mean, we see this in most podcasts out there, whether it be about politics, whether it be about science and culture, maybe it's about weightlifting. It could be about any of these topics that are out there. But what you're seeing inside of these podcasts, if you're looking especially to learn something, is you're seeing the purpose is to help the listeners, to help the listener to come in and become closer into your universe or into your orbit. So when we come to the solo podcaster and whether or not you should script out the podcast itself, I'm going to actually recommend against scripting this out. And there's a good reason for this, all right? Now, let's say you are the solo podcaster, you're sitting in bed at night one night and you come up with this topic and it's about how to make cats not shed as much. And you have this whole theory on why you think that you can cut down on the shedding of cats' hair, okay? And you sit down with your laptop and you write down this entire script and you're like, this is a really good podcast that I can go ahead and record. So you write it all out and it's like 10 pages, but it took you like 2.5, 3 hours to go ahead and create. And then now you have to go in and you have to record this entire podcast. All right. Now, is this a good or a bad thing? I'm not going to say it is a good or a bad thing, but I will tell you this. That's a lot of time to create a blog post. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to take that amount of time to create a solo podcast, but most podcasts are anywhere between the 11 to 15 minute mark, and then you see the really good podcasters doing about an hour, okay? And if you want to grow as a podcaster, you're going to have to start stepping out of your comfort zone. This means that I'm going to ask you as the podcaster, going to ask you to start writing down your bullet points. Write down bullet points on a pad of paper of the things that you want to talk about, because when we jump out of our comfort zone of just reading from a script, it's going to teach us how to become a better public speaker. And there's no better way to become a better public speaker than to speak into a microphone, a little more impromptu, but with a guide. If you ever notice me do these videos, I'm always writing notes. I have a pad of paper, I have a piece of paper, and I have notes that are written down, and I always refer to them. I'm always looking at them. I mean, right here, I'm looking at right here, my point number 2 that I'll be talking about here shortly. So write down bullet points, because you are the expert of your particular podcast, and you can probably elaborate on it better and develop the relationship by sharing your own feelings and thoughts as opposed to just reading it out. Number 2, if you're going to script out your entire solo podcast, you have to be aware of this. You're going to burn out. Unless writing is the thing that you love to do, you're going to burn out. You have to consider the time it's going to take to write out that entire podcast for your solo podcast. We're talking, it's just you talking. There's no interviews, all right? So you're thinking maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours to write out the script. Maybe it's an hour. I don't know. But then it's going to take probably another, 30 minutes to go ahead and read that out. Maybe it's going to take 15 minutes. We have to consider the time it's going to take. And I know you as the solo podcaster, you're going to be too worried about how you speak into the microphone. I'm going to tell you right now, there's no better way to practice on becoming a better public speaker than to write bullet points out and speak into the microphone and talk about your points at certain lengths, all right? Talk about your bullet points for about 2 minutes and then move on to the next bullet point, or maybe talk about a bullet point for a minute and then move on to the next point. Unless you have something really that you want to say, you're going to want to figure out and have those structured on your piece of paper. Next, let's consider mixing up your podcasting strategy. Instead of just doing a solo podcast, why don't you add perspective to your podcast? And when I'm talking about perspective, I'm talking about including an interview within your podcast, because once you include someone else's perspective, it's going to change the entire dynamic of the podcast. So if you're going to do interviews, I have videos up here that can go ahead and teach you all about how to create Skype interviews. You don't necessarily need to bring them into your house. You can do them over Skype and they'll help you out. So add some perspective to your solo podcast. Lastly, this is something that seems very logical, but I have to reiterate it for those who are stumbling onto this video. It's that I want you to focus on creating quality content. Just don't put out any old content and do a 5-day-a-week podcast. If it doesn't have quality to it, then it's not going to matter. I have a friend of mine right now who does a solo podcast, but she invites guests in on her podcast, and those guests share their perspective on whatever it is that they are talking about for that day. It's my friend hosting the podcast, but she's asking someone else to come in and share their perspective while she gets to share her own perspective. And in turn, she is developing and pumping out quality content to someone out there who is looking for the answer. And in her particular case, it's all about the weight loss journey. So it's definitely going to help someone out, whether you're doing a podcast about literature, whether you're doing a podcast about acting, whether it's a podcast about computers, whatever you may be. Add some depth into your solo podcast so that you can start seeing it grow and mushroom. We have to remember that as podcasters, we want to have a podcast that is growing. So you as a person have to develop and grow along with the podcast and consider jumping outside of your comfort zones. Don't consider just doing a solo podcast and reading it all out, because you will burn out. I promise you that. You're gonna pod fade. That's why you see a lot of podcasts in the Apple iTunes store that just they're no longer there. They're just not producing anymore. But the good ones, they understand the concept of bringing other perspectives inside of their solo podcast. If you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up and share it out with a bunch of friends who are trying to figure out the podcasting game and a little bit struggling just a little bit about what they should do when it comes down to a solo podcast. And of course, if you're looking for the right equipment to start a solo podcast, I have an essential equipment guide that you can go ahead and check out in the description down below of this YouTube video. It will definitely give you all of those answers and where you can start by getting that equipment and starting your own podcast. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. I've clocked over 5,000 subscriptions for this YouTube channel, which I never thought was something that I would ever do. But I want to thank all of you guys for becoming subscribers and sharing these videos out with your friends. And of course, I'm glad these videos are helping you out with your podcasting journey. There's a video over here on your right-hand side that will help you with your podcasting journey, or maybe it's something that will help enhance your podcasting journey. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next time.